October 8th, 1871. Sunday evening in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Families are finishing supper. Children are being called in from the yard. The smell of wood smoke hangs in the air, but that's nothing unusual. It always smells like smoke here. It has all summer. On the main street, men step out of the tavern into the cool night air. At the woodenware factory, the largest of its kind in the entire United States, the last shift is winding down. Sawdust covers the streets like snow. The sidewalks are made of wood. The roads are packed with wood chips. Every building in town is timber. Even the church where Father Peter Pernin said Mass this morning is made of pine. By midnight, every one of those buildings will be ash. By morning, between 1,500 and 2,500 people in this valley will be dead. The exact number will never be known because the records burn too. This is the story of the deadliest wildfire in American history. Not the Great Chicago Fire. You've heard of that one. This is a fire that happened the same night, 260 miles to the north, that killed at least 5 times as many people. The fire that history forgot. Peshtigo, Wisconsin, October 1871. Population, approximately 1,700. But calling Peshtigo just another frontier town would be like calling it just another dot on a map. In 1871, Peshtigo was booming. William B. Ogden, Chicago millionaire, former mayor of Chicago, one of the most powerful businessmen in the Midwest, had built his woodenware factory here. Wooden tubs, pails, broom handles, barrel staves, products that a rapidly expanding America needed by the millions, shipped south to Chicago, the world's largest lumber market, and from there to the rest of the country. The factory was the beating heart of the town. Around it had grown a real community. Boarding houses for the workers, shops and saloons along the main street, a church, a school, immigrant families, German, Irish, Scandinavian, who had come here for the work and planted roots. Children who had known no other home. And surrounding all of it, pressing in from every direction, the forest. Vast, ancient, seemingly endless stands of oak and maple and pine stretching across northeastern Wisconsin toward Lake Michigan. Beautiful, profitable, and in the autumn of 1871, catastrophically dry. The summer of 1871 was one of the driest ever recorded across the Great Lakes region. By October, what should have been a lush northern forest had become a tinderbox. From Canada to Iowa, smaller fires had been burning for weeks. Farmers used the slash and burn method to clear land, setting controlled fires that weren't always controlled. Railroad workers cleared brush with fire, leaving piles of cut timber next to the tracks where sparks from passing steam engines could reach them. The logging industry stripped the land bare, leaving massive piles of slash, branches, bark, sawdust, scattered across tens of thousands of acres. In Peshtigo itself, the very things that made the town prosperous made it a death trap. The streets were covered in sawdust. The sidewalks were wooden planks. The roads were packed with wood chips from the factory. Every structure was timber frame. There was no brick, no stone, no fire break of any kind between the town and the surrounding forest. All summer, residents smelled smoke on the air. Smaller fires had burned nearby. On September 23rd, the town had stockpiled extra water near the factory just in case. Just in case. But nobody was panicking. This was logging country. Fire was part of life. The smoke was just the smell of progress. There was, however, one man who was not reassured. Professor Increase Lapham was Wisconsin's most respected meteorologist. He had spent years studying the weather patterns of the Great Lakes region, and what he saw in the summer of 1871 terrified him. He had been documenting the drought for months, measuring rainfall that was far below normal, tracking temperature anomalies, watching the moisture drain out of the forests. He understood what the combination of extreme drought, vast accumulations of slashed timber, and shifting autumn winds could produce. Lapham had petitioned the federal government repeatedly to establish a proper weather warning system for the region. The request had been ignored. Politics, budget concerns, the priorities of men in Washington who had never seen a Wisconsin forest in October. Lapham kept filing his reports. The government kept filing them away. On October 8, 1871, everything Lapham feared arrived at once. A cold front swept in from the west late that afternoon, pushing ahead of it a wall of wind. Not a gentle autumn breeze. A weather system powerful enough to accelerate the dozens of small fires already burning across the region, merging them, feeding them, transforming them into something that had no name yet in 1871. Something scientists today call a firestorm, nature's nuclear explosion. In the words of fire researchers Denise Guess and William Lutz, a firestorm produces superheated flames of at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, advancing on winds of 110 miles per hour or stronger. When it erupts in a dense forest, it doesn't just burn the trees. It consumes the oxygen in the air. It creates its own weather. It generates fire whirls, tornadoes made entirely of flame, that can throw railroad cars and houses into the air. The people of Peshtigo had no concept of any of this. They just knew the sky was turning red. The fire moved first through the tiny settlement of Sugar Bush, a small farming community a few miles from Peshtigo. It arrived without warning, a wall of flame and superheated air, and it did not slow down. Every single resident of Sugar Bush was killed. The fire didn't leave survivors to tell what happened. It left nothing. By 9 o'clock that evening, Father Peter Pernin was standing outside his church in Peshtigo, looking west. He was a Catholic priest, a French-Canadian missionary, who had spent years serving the logging communities of northeastern Wisconsin. He had seen hard winters. He had seen sickness. He had seen the ordinary suffering of frontier life. He had never seen anything like what he was looking at now. To the west, above the dense cloud of smoke that had been hanging over the earth all day, he could see a vivid red reflection of immense extent. And then he heard it. A distant roaring sound, muffled but growing, announcing that the elements were in commotion somewhere. A sound he couldn't name. A sound no one in Peshtigo had ever heard before. He stood very still, listening. Around him, the town was strangely quiet. Then the wind hit. In an instant, Peshtigo became chaos. Father Pernin later wrote, "The air was no longer fit to breathe, full as it was of sand, dust, ashes, cinders, sparks, smoke, and fire." It was almost impossible to keep one's eyes unclosed, to distinguish the road, or to recognize people, though the way was crowded with pedestrians, as well as vehicles crossing and crashing against each other in the general flight. Some were hastening towards the river, others from it, whilst all were struggling alike in the grasp of the hurricane. 1,000 discordant, deafening noises rose on the air together. The neighing of horses, falling of chimneys, crashing of uprooted trees, roaring and whistling of the wind, crackling of fire as it ran with lightning-like rapidity from house to house. The fire moved through Peshtigo the way water moves through a broken dam, not spreading from building to building the way ordinary fires do. This wasn't ordinary fire. The firestorm generated temperatures hot enough to cause trees to literally explode. Witnesses reported sheets of flame, 200 feet high, launched horizontally by the wind. Buildings didn't catch fire and burn. They ignited all at once, every surface simultaneously, and were gone in minutes. The wooden sidewalks burned. The sawdust-covered streets burned. The bridges over the Peshtigo River caught fire, and then the fire crossed the river itself, riding the bridges and the superheated air drafts, burning both banks simultaneously. There was no safe side of the river. There was no safe side of anything. 200 people died inside a single tavern. They had run there instinctively, looking for walls, for shelter, for something solid to put between themselves and the fire. The tavern burned in minutes. 200 people. 3 men found a large water tank and climbed in, submerging themselves to escape the flames. The firestorm heated the tank. The water boiled. All 3 died. There was one place that offered any real chance of survival, the Peshtigo River itself. Not the banks, the river. In the water, up to your neck, keeping your head down, breathing the thin layer of air just above the surface, while the world burned around you. Father Pernin ran for the river, pulling a small cart containing the sacred vessels from his church behind him. He later described wading into the current and turning to watch his church, his life's work in this community, vanish in flame. Around him in the black water were hundreds of people, families clinging to each other, horses terrified and thrashing, cattle pressed against the human survivors seeking instinctively the same refuge. Some people made it to the river only to drown in the panic. Others succumbed to hypothermia. The river was not warm and the night was long. One man, so certain the fire would reach them in the water, made a decision no parent should ever have to make. Accounts record that he slit the throats of his own children to spare them from burning alive. He could not save them from the river. He could not save them from the fire. He chose the quickest death. The firestorm had generated a fire whirl, a tornado of flame that tore through the town with a sound witnesses compared to 1,000 freight trains at once. It lifted buildings from their foundations. It sent railroad cars tumbling through the air. It stripped bark from trees and drove it like shrapnel through anything in its path. From the river, Father Pernin and the survivors watched Peshtigo burn. The whole town, the factory, the church, the school, the boarding houses, every shop, every home, consumed in under an hour. Not damaged, not partially burned. Gone. Erased. By midnight, the wind began to ease. By dawn, the sky cleared enough to see, and what the survivors of the Peshtigo River saw, climbing out of the frigid water, waterlogged and burned and shaking, was nothing. Where Peshtigo had stood, there were chimneys, bare foundations, twisted metal from the factory equipment, melted and fused into strange shapes by temperatures that shouldn't have been possible from wood. The iron fire engine the town had kept for emergencies had been reduced to slag. 2 feet away from the melted engine, newspaper accounts would later note with bewilderment, a wooden fence post still had its paint on it. The fire was so extreme, so selective in its destruction, that survivors who made it through couldn't explain why they had and their neighbors hadn't. People burned to death within 10 feet of people who walked away. The town's records were ash. The census was ash. The church registry where Father Pernin had recorded every baptism, every marriage, every death in his parish. Ash. There was no way to count the dead because there was no way to know who had lived there. More than 350 bodies were buried in a mass grave because they were burned beyond identification, not beyond recognition as individuals, beyond recognition as human beings. The fire had burned so hot that many could not be identified even as men or women. And Peshtigo was not alone. The same night, the same fire system had consumed the village of Sugarbush entirely. It had burned through Brussels, through Williamsonville, through a dozen smaller communities and isolated logging camps across a corridor of destruction 10 miles wide and 40 miles long. 16 communities destroyed, 1.2 million acres burned, a landscape the size of Rhode Island, twice over, reduced to ash and bare earth. The total death toll across all the communities, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people. The exact number was never determined and never will be, because the records of most of those communities burned with the communities themselves. Whole families were wiped out with no one left to report them missing. In some camps, every man was gone and no one on the outside even knew they had been there. But here is the cruelest part of the story. The thing that would haunt Peshtigo for the next 150 years. That same night, 260 miles to the south, another fire broke out. In Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 burned for 2 days. It destroyed 17,000 structures. It left 100,000 people homeless. It killed approximately 300 people. 300. Against Peshtigo's 2,000. But Chicago had newspapers. Chicago had telegraph lines. Chicago had reporters on the scene within hours, filing dispatches that traveled instantly to New York, to Boston, to Washington, to London. Chicago was the great American city of the Midwest, the symbol of the nation's westward ambition, and its burning was an international story. Peshtigo's telegraph lines had burned in the first minutes of the fire. There were no reporters in Peshtigo. There were barely any survivors capable of making it to the nearest working telegraph office. The news came out slowly in fragments, delayed by days. By the time the full scale of the Wisconsin disaster reached the nation's newspapers, every front page was already consumed with Chicago. America mourned Chicago. Donations poured in. President Grant toured the ruins. The nation rallied. Peshtigo received a fraction of the attention and a fraction of the aid. What help did arrive came slowly, disorganized, hampered by the destruction of roads and bridges. People were starving in the ruins while the country wept for a city whose death toll was 1/7 as large. When Governor Lucius Fairchild of Wisconsin toured the disaster zone, he was visibly shaken by what he saw. He wrote that the scale of destruction in the Peshtigo region was unlike anything he could have imagined. He appealed for federal assistance. Congress passed a modest relief bill. It was a fraction of what had been allocated for Chicago. Increase Lapham, the meteorologist who had spent years warning about exactly this kind of catastrophe, whose requests for a proper weather warning system had been repeatedly ignored, now watched as the country focused its grief on a city while the deadliest fire in American history was folded into a footnote. Lapham kept working. He continued pushing for a national weather service with real forecasting capability. Within months of the fire, partly as a result of the disasters of 1871, the United States Weather Bureau began a serious expansion of its forecasting operations. The infrastructure that would eventually become the National Weather Service has Increase Lapham's fingerprints all over it. He never got the credit. Almost no one has heard his name. William Ogden, whose factory was at the center of the disaster, returned to Peshtigo briefly. He provided some aid. He considered rebuilding. progress was slow, and most of the factory never reopened. The economic engine of the town was gone, and without the factory, there was little reason for the town to exist at the scale it once had. Peshtigo rebuilt, slowly. The population never fully recovered. The logging industry, whose practices had turned the landscape into a tinderbox, faced no meaningful reckoning. Slash and burn continued. The clear-cutting continued. In 1881, just 10 years after Peshtigo, another catastrophic fire swept through the Thumb area of Lower Michigan, burning over 1 million acres. It was fueled by the same practices that had fed the Peshtigo fire. The timber industry had learned nothing because it had been asked to learn nothing. No investigation, no accountability, no inquiry into why the forest had been so recklessly stripped, why the slash had been piled so carelessly next to the railroad tracks, why the slash and burn method was allowed to continue in drought conditions. No one was charged. No one was fined. No one answered for 2,000 deaths. The Peshtigo fire passed into the category of natural disaster, an act of God. Nobody's fault, except a man named Increase Lapham had warned them for years, and they had filed his letters away. At Grandview Cemetery in Peshtigo, a mass grave holds more than 350 victims. The headstones don't have names on most of them. They can't. The fire saw to that. Nearby stands the Peshtigo Fire Museum, housed in a former church building, one of the only structures of its kind in a town that was completely erased. Inside are artifacts recovered from the ruins, first-person accounts, photographs of what the town looked like 1 month before it died. October 8th, 1871, the night 2,000 people burned while America watched Chicago. The same night, the same weather system, 5 times the death toll, 1/10 the coverage, 0 accountability. Father Peter Pernin, who survived the Peshtigo River, spent 3 years writing down everything he witnessed. He published his account in 1874. He called it, "The Finger of God is There." He was a man of faith, and he framed what he saw in the language of faith. But he also recorded what human carelessness looked like when nature finally ran out of patience. The deadliest wildfire in American history killed at least 2,000 people on October 8, 1871. It happened the same night as a much smaller fire in Chicago that you were probably taught about in school. You weren't taught about Peshtigo. Now you know, and the forests are drier now than they were in 1871. The winds are stronger, the fire seasons are longer, the slash, different now, not sawdust and timber but drought-killed brush and beetle-eaten pines, is piled across millions of acres of American wilderness. Increase Lapham filed his warnings. They were ignored. Remember Peshtigo. Remember what fire can do when no one is watching. And remember that it can do it again.